Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to peel back the layers on the war in Ukraine, digging into the decades of complex history that led us to the biggest conflict in Europe since the Second World War.
You know, the full-scale invasion back in February 2022, it really just shocked the world. It's a war that has created a massive refugee crisis and, tragically, has led to hundreds of thousands of deaths.
And this timeline, it just gives you a snapshot of how dynamic and brutal this war has been. Russia's initial plan for a lightning-fast victory, to capture Kyiv, that failed within weeks. So they shifted gears, focusing on the east and south, eventually annexing 4 provinces. And now, in a pretty incredible turn of events, the war has spilled back across the border into Russia itself.
Now, this was the official line from President Vladimir Putin. This was his justification for an invasion that, let's be clear, was overwhelmingly and immediately condemned by the international community.
But here's the thing. To really understand how we got to this point, we have to rewind. This conflict absolutely did not start in 2022. Its roots, well, they run much, much deeper.
So our story really begins right at the end of the Cold War, with the collapse of the Soviet Union back in 1991.
And this slide right here shows such a critical moment. So, in 1994, the brand new nation of Ukraine gave up what was then the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, a huge deal. In exchange, it got a promise, the Budapest Memorandum, signed by Russia, the US, and the UK to protect its borders and sovereignty. But then, 20 years later, that foundational promise was just completely shattered.
In the years after the Soviet collapse, you started to see these two paths emerge. Ukraine was looking more and more to the West, wanting closer ties with Europe. At the same time, Russia began to see these shifting alliances right on its border as a direct threat to its own security.
And from Moscow's perspective, NATO's expansion into countries that used to be part of the Eastern Bloc, it felt like a hostile encirclement. President Putin has argued again and again that this broke informal promises made after the Cold War, basically erasing the strategic buffer zone Russia had always relied on.
But, and this is a really important but, for the countries that had lived under Soviet control for decades, joining NATO wasn't about provoking Russia. It was about making sure they would never lose their freedom again. They were looking at events like the brutal war in Chechnya and seeing the alliance as their only real security guarantee.
So these tensions were just simmering under the surface, and they really came to a head in the 2000s, with a couple of key events that just dramatically raised the stakes. First up, 2004. You have Ukrainians pouring into the streets for the Orange Revolution. They successfully challenged a rigged election, and that was a huge victory for pro-Western forces in the country. Now, it's worth noting that our source material points out that Russian military officials didn't see this as a grassroots movement. They viewed these color revolutions as Western-backed plots designed to undermine Russia from the inside. Okay, let's fast forward to 2008. Ukraine and Georgia are now formally asking to join NATO, but the alliance was totally split. They put out a statement saying the countries would become members eventually, but they put off the actual membership process, which just laid bare this deep division on how to deal with Russia's really fierce opposition.
And what happened just a few months after that summit? Russia invaded Georgia. The international backlash was, well, pretty limited. And analysts like Samuel Romani argue that this muted response sent a really dangerous signal to Moscow that it could use military force to get what it wants. It was basically seen as a green light for future action.
And all of this brings us to 2014. This is the year the conflict went from being a political struggle to a full-blown hot war.
It all kicked off in late 2013 with the Euromaidan protests. This started because the pro-Russian president suddenly backed out of a trade deal with the EU. But things escalated, and by February 2014, the protests had turned deadly. Over 100 people were killed. In the end, the president signed a deal and then immediately fled the country, and his entire government just collapsed. Russia saw the chaos in Kyiv as a golden opportunity, and they put their 2014 playbook into action. First, they sent in those unmarked troops, you probably remember them as the Little Green Men, to occupy Crimea. Then, after a totally disputed referendum, they annexed the peninsula. And at the exact same time, they started backing armed militants who seized territory in the eastern Donbas region.
And that kicked off the first phase of the Russo-Ukrainian War. For 8 long years, a brutal, grinding trench war raged in eastern Ukraine. It was a deadly, simmering conflict that, frankly, most of the Western world kind of forgot about, right up until the full-scale invasion in 2022.
So,
We've walked through all this history. How do we pull it all together? Well, political scientist Paul Dianieri gives us a really helpful framework for understanding the core causes.
And this framework is so useful because it shows it wasn't just one thing. So first, you have Russia's long-term goal of bringing Ukraine back into its orbit. Second is Russia's own self-image as a great power that feels entitled to a sphere of influence. Third, you have that classic security dilemma. Russia sees NATO expansion as a huge threat, while its neighbors see it as vital protection. And finally, and this might be the most crucial point of all, the very existence of a successful, democratic, pro-Western Ukraine was seen as an ideological threat to Russia's own authoritarian government.
So when you understand these deep, interconnected roots, you realize this is so much more than a war over territory. It's a clash of histories, a clash of identities, and a clash of competing visions for the entire future of Europe. And the world is still grappling with the consequences.